Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Robson, and I'm going to talk to you about the IRAC method in this video. You're probably familiar with the IRAC method, which is issue, rule, analysis, and conclusion. It's a common approach to solving legal problems at law school and in practice. But I thought today it might be best just to talk about a practical example, which is fictitious, and just consider what the possible issues might be and how the rules and analysis might go. So here is an example about two people, John and Fred, and I'll briefly go over the facts and start to talk about the issues that are revealed. So we know at the beginning, John and Fred want to go into business together. So we've identified two important parties. Part of what they're seeking to do is to purchase a car for ride sharing, and they need to obtain finance. After some time of discussions, the business does start and an ABN is registered. The income is to be split 50% from the business. But because Fred doesn't have an income and assets, John signs an agreement to buy a Tesla Model 3 for $60,000, and he's going to use it in the business. He gets that finance from Tesla Finance. The problem here for John is he's solely liable under that finance agreement because he does not disclose the business partnership on the finance application. Now, a few weeks later, John loses his license. Now, he doesn't tell Fred about these prior indiscretions. And to make matters worse, John's employer, Dry Truck Hire, dismisses John because he can't drive the employer's trucks anymore. John tells Fred he can't drive for 6 months. So we can see from those initial facts that in fact there's 4 parties that are worth considering: John and Fred, the people involved in the business. Tesla Finance is the finance company, and Dry Truck Hire is John's former employer. Now, Fred works for the next 4 months, but they're simply unable to cover the business costs. The finance repayments and other business costs are exceeding the income. John's continuing to pay the car finance and is losing money. John's paying the business costs from his own savings. Fred tells John he cannot continue to drive for no income and does not contact John again, and the car is parked at John's house. Now, John contacts you to obtain advice about his situation. Well, part of the step about the issues is certainly one of carefully determining which parties might be involved, because that will lead you to the issues. So we know that there's a business, seemingly a partnership between John and Fred. The ABN registration being in joint names will have an impact on how the income and expenses is treated for tax law purposes. So that's a separate kind of issue. The finance arrangement with Tesla Finance and John is a separate agreement. We know John didn't disclose the business partnership on the finance application, and we're told that he is solely liable for that. John has equally purchased the car in his name as well. So combined, John has the car as an asset and the finance as a liability. So he might be subject to a loss there, but we're told it's related to the conduct of the business. The business doesn't go for long. It seems that Fred has walked away from the partnership. It would be necessary to consider if the partnership had in fact dissolved, so resort to the Partnership Act. We're not told what jurisdiction, but resort to the Partnership Act in the jurisdiction where you are would be relevant. There's also the employer dry truck hire, which John's been dismissed. He potentially has rights against his employer. It's a proprietary limited company, so it would come under the Federal Industrial Relations Law. So there's an issue there that's worth exploring about whether John has been unfairly dismissed as well. Essentially, issues that people tend to raise, whilst they're not limited to money problems and liability issues, tend to be the kinds of questions that come into a law firm's office. Here, those issues are ever present. A person's losing money from a business and is considering what to do about it. So certainly analysis of the partnership arrangement, how the tax law works in this instance, how the partnership was operating and if it's dissolved and on what date it's been dissolved, and whether there's an unfair dismissal claim that might be available to John. It may also be practically that John's situation is that he can wait a little bit longer to obtain his license back, accept that the partnership did cease and continue on. And it may be that he can recover the losses and potentially make money from the venture. That's not necessarily the most important issue, but it might be important to tell John that it's an option, because financially he might not be in a position to address any conclusions you reach about his rights against Fred. It may be that Fred does have a significant liability for half of the losses from the operation of the business. So certainly an accountant would need to consider the income and expenses of the business to determine the loss, and a tax return would certainly need to be prepared. Whether Fred and John ultimately sign a return would be something for the future to be determined, but at the very least determining the nature and extent of the loss would guide Fred as to how he might proceed. Where the losses are reasonably limited, the advice might be to John that whilst he has rights, it might not be economic to pursue them. And the other consideration may be whether the sale of the vehicle is appropriate to discharge the finance, and it may be that there's a loss there as well. So crystallising the loss may be important for John to determine the total losses. But that does depend somewhat on John's conclusions that he draws himself about what to do. Lawyers, of course, don't give financial advice to clients. They can only talk to how the law interacts with the facts that they've been given. And it may be that John needs to obtain separate advice financially about what he should do in light of the advice provided. I hope that gives you some insight about how to approach a fictitious problem using the IRAC method. As I say, the important initial step is identifying all of the parties. It's something that is often overlooked, even by junior lawyers. And a failure to identify all of the parties can lead to not identifying all of the relevant issues that might need to be considered as part of the problem. Thank you.